Sunday afternoon indicates the strength of our spirit. Let's keep up the pressure on the people we know to get vaccinated, to wear masks indoors, and take the safety measures necessary so that someday taking time to be together is not taking a risk. Safety is what we are all about, not out of fear, but out of this for the stability of our society. Nothing threatens that more than the constant barrage of brutal gun violence in our schools, in our stores, and even in our places of worship. No problem is unsolvable if you have the will to do it, and our experts you will be hearing from shortly have that. Grassroots North Shore will do our part in this fight, and if it is one you are thinking of, this program will direct your energies. Before we turn to our program, a word of thanks to our sponsors, Wisconsin Jewish Democrats, Moms Demand Action, the Brady Group, the League of Progressive Seniors, and our good friends at WAVE. As for our presenters, we are lucky to have Deb Andraka representing the North Shore's 23rd Assembly District, who has a long time involvement in this fight. And hopefully we will be joined by Senator LaTanya Johnson, the voice of the 6th District, covering Milwaukee's west side and adjoining suburbs. Also joining us is Annalise Dickman of the Brady Group, a longtime advocate for gun safety, who will take over as moderator for the presentations and will be handling Q&A at the end of the program. As for that segment, use the Q&A button on your screen to send questions to our panelists at the end of their presentations. So don't be shy. Here's another event I want to tell you about to help keep the great work going from Grassroots North Shore. Our organization will be holding our annual fundraiser again, this time virtually. We will be featuring Kurt Bangstad, one of the loudest progressive voices in Wisconsin's up north, who is fighting to preserve democracy in our state. He has made a lot of waves and has attracted a lot of support north of Highway 29. Not to mention his Minocqua Brewing Company has pumped out a lot of good tasting beer, which is available throughout the Milwaukee metropolitan area. Since the fundraiser is on the threshold of the holiday, think about gifting a Grassroots North Shore membership to those smarter people in your social circle. We hope to see you at the fundraiser for a rousing presentation by Kirk. This is also a great time to renew your membership if it has lapsed. Okay, now it's time to turn the video screen over to Deb Andraka.
Thank you, Keith. It is so great to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity. I started off as a volunteer with Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense, and I ran largely on a platform because of gun safety, because I didn't feel like my representative was listening to me. And a theme that I talk about a lot is that if I couldn't change my representative's mind, I'd have to change his job. And I was very fortunate that I was able to do so. The significance of that win, I try to remind many of my colleagues about that, is that I ran front and center on a gun safety platform and I won. And that I believe I'm one of the very first people to do that, which I think shows the strength of the issue that we're talking about here today. That about 5-10 years ago, people were afraid to take on the gun lobby. And now we can, we should, and we have to, because we have too many people who are losing their lives at the hands of firearms. We all know about the big lie that too many of my colleagues actually believe, that Donald Trump won the election. But there's actually another big lie that we're talking about here today. The big lie that a gun in your home will help keep you safe and protect those around you. Too many of us have this belief that the proverbial good guy with a gun can protect their family and can stop a mass shooting. But without training, without safe storage, and without a culture of gun safety, this simply isn't the case. I hear over and over again from my Republican colleagues, guns don't kill people, people do. I hear we don't need more laws, we just need to enforce the ones we have. And that they always bring up Chicago. Chicago has strict gun laws and they have terrible gun violence. Gun laws don't work. That's what they say. But what they do is absolutely nothing. They don't even bring up a resolution. I had a resolution in June simply saying that June would be Gun Violence Awareness Month, they wouldn't even put it on the calendar. And if we can't talk about the rise in gun violence, especially suicides and the number of people who are losing their losing their lives at the hand of gun violence, then that is something that we need to address, and we need to get across that this is something that we should be talking about as a state. There was a great article last month in the Atlantic magazine by David Frum talking about just how many more guns have been purchased. 23 million guns were purchased in 2020 alone, up 65% from 2019. And a lot of this was because of the pandemic, but what that means is that there are more guns in more homes. And unless we are working on securing them, we have just orders of magnitude opportunities for more tragedy. The first time gun purchases were especially high, and only 11.5 million Americans hunt. So if 23 million guns were purchased in 2020, and you have about 11 million Americans who go hunting, you have to wonder, what are all of these guns doing? And there are an awful lot of people who still believe that having a gun in the home will keep people safe. Everytown for Gun Safety recently came out with a study called Preventable Tragedies, and it highlights the risk of having firearms around your home that aren't secured. Wisconsin ranks 14th in the nation for unintended child shootings. And Children's Hospital of Wisconsin recently did a series called Kids in the Crossfire, which is never a title that you ever want to come across. But there was a huge spike in the number of kids who were getting injured by unintentional shootings because they were coming across guns that were in their home. And this is something that as a state, we really need to be talking about. Now, what should we be doing? We should be passing laws that will keep people safe. But let me tell you a little bit about some of the laws that have come across my desk as co-sponsorship memos. Some of the laws include, there is a bill that would reduce the age for concealed carry to 18. One would restrict the enforcement of federal gun laws, so you couldn't actually enforce federal gun laws within the state. It's not constitutional, but they still introduce a legislation. They want to make Wisconsin a Second Amendment sanctuary. They want to have no permit required for concealed carry. So it's called concealed carry reciprocity, meaning states like Texas, where you don't need any kind of safety training whatsoever, someone from Texas could come to Wisconsin and carry their gun around legally. We all know that that does not keep our community safe. They want to limit liability for firearms manufacturers. They want to allow guns on school grounds. They want to allow guns in cars on school grounds. They want to allow guns in places of worship that are attached to schools. Each one of these has been a separate bill that is up for consideration. And each one of those takes our state in the absolute wrong direction. We need to have legislation that keeps people safe. What we need are bills such as Senate Bill 461, which would ban ghost guns and undetectable firearms. These are becoming more and more of a problem. You can go online and buy a kit to make your own gun, so you don't have to buy that at a licensed firearms dealer. Pretty soon this week, we will be reintroducing extreme risk protection orders and background checks on all gun sales. These are two basic measures that do not interfere with anyone's ability to own a firearm, but they do help keep guns out of the wrong hands, and they do help keep people in Wisconsin safe. So these are all things that we need to do. We need to be able to talk about this. And those kinds of bills, we need to have public hearings. Too often, these legislation is introduced and they won't even give it a public hearing when we know that 80% of Wisconsinites support common sense gun legislation. I see Senator Johnson there. Okay, she's here. Just wanted to make sure that you were there. So I talked a little bit about some of the bills and a little bit about some of the legislation that has crossed my desk. But Senator Johnson represents Wisconsin's 6th Senate District, a district that knows a lot more gun violence than most. And she has been around a lot longer than I have, and she has always been a fierce advocate for better gun laws. And she speaks from the heart, from our need to take action, and also from personal experience. So Senator, I will turn it over to you now.
Have having me. Gun violence is something that is near and dear to my heart. Representing the city of Milwaukee, I have seen my share of gun violence and how that affects the individuals here in the city of Milwaukee, as well as our children. When I was first elected to the state assembly, gun violence became a particular interest for me with the death of a 10-year-old little girl. Her name was Sierra Guyton. Sierra Guyton was playing on the playground across the street from her home during an after-school program. It was on a playground of about 70 kids. Two convicted felons got into an argument. 18 bullets flew across that playground. One struck Sierra in her head. And after that happened, I went to the funeral and I was just numbstruck because I was sitting on a bench in my district, not that far away from where Sierra Guyton lived, probably about 30 blocks or so. And I saw kids out running around and they were just playing and they were having fun. And these kids lived in a different zip code. They were predominantly white and they looked like they were having the time of their life and they were safe. And it dawned on me that if Sierra lived just 20 to 30 blocks down the street, if she had a different zip code, she would still be here. And that was unacceptable to me. So I set out to find legislation that would prevent another child from dying. But after Sierra Guyton, there was Layla Peterson, the 5-year-old little girl that was shot in the head while sitting on her grandfather's lap. There was Baby Bill Tao. Baby Bill Tao was 13 months old. For his 14-month birthday, I was sitting in his funeral. I went up and I talked to the mom. She was there physically, but mentally she wasn't. Her phone had pictures and they were going across the screen. And one of the pictures that I noticed on her phone was of Baby Bill Tao. And you could tell that he was in his hospital bed. There were tubes that were coming out of him, but they weren't connected to anything. And I remember thinking to myself that this lady has the last picture of her baby dead in a hospital bed. When I think about Sierra's funeral and Layla's funeral and Baby Bill Tao's funeral, the wails that came from Sierra's family when they closed that casket, I remember her grandmother standing up and sharing with the congregation that she was angry. She was so angry. She didn't want to be, but she was angry because that happened to her grandchild. And here in Milwaukee, for so many families that live, especially on the north side, there's a sense of anger because of the gun violence, but there's also a sense of fear. Kids don't freely play on the streets like they do in other neighborhoods because the families are afraid of gun violence. One of the things that I've noticed since being in the state legislature is that most people are law-abiding citizens. They'll do, what the law requires. But if the law doesn't require common sense gun legislation, then there's no checks and balances, even for those who are intentional on doing the right thing. For example, when individuals purchase guns, and they do it from reputable legal dealers, like, Gander Mountain or Blaine's Farm and Fleet, you have to go through a background check to obtain those guns. You have to wait until that background check comes back before you're able to take possession of the gun, just to make sure that you are not barred from having access. But then those same individuals that legally purchase those guns can also legally sell those guns without requiring a background check to just regular everyday citizens. As a matter of fact, if you're looking for a gun, you can go on armslist.com and you can legally purchase a gun without having to obtain a background check from another individual. And that is just, it defeats the purpose of having those stringent background checks from reputable dealers, because if I'm a felon, a convicted felon, and I'm not supposed to have a gun, all I have to do is go to armslist.com or go to an individual, a person who's selling a gun. No questions are asked. They're not required to ask if you're a convicted felon. They're not even required to care. And so that's the issue, because in the city of Milwaukee, the police usually confiscate over 2,000 guns a year. And that is from illegal individuals that shouldn't have access to guns. We even have a gun court here in Milwaukee where they specialize in only gun crimes. And the individuals who go through those courts are very seldomly first-time gun offenders who are caught in the possession of a gun. They're typically convicted felons who are on their second and their third possession of a gun as a convicted felon. And that just doesn't make sense. For example, in the state of Wisconsin, it is not required that you report your gun lost or stolen. Now that's stupid. Why would you not be required to report a gun if it's lost or stolen? There's no law requiring that. And for a very long time, people use that as a loophole to get out of being charged with straw purchases. Straw purchases are individuals who legally buy guns in their names because they're not convicted felons, but then they give those guns to people who are prohibited from having them, such as a girlfriend with no prior felony convictions would buy a gun for her boyfriend who was a convicted felon. And then if that gun was caught in the commission of a crime, they would just say that the gun was lost or stolen. There was no mandatory reporting. That would be the end of it. Just recently, over these last couple of sessions, we did manage to strengthen that law to make sure that we can hold straw purchasers accountable by charging those individuals with felonies if needed. So that was just a couple of the stupid laws that we have in Wisconsin. Also in Wisconsin, for just these last sessions, I believe, acted for 2 sessions, it used to be that were not convicted of a felony, you could legally apply for and get a concealed carry holder permit if you took the concealed holder classes. Now, the only thing that would prevent someone from being prohibited from owning a gun or carrying a gun as a concealed carry holder is also misdemeanor domestic abuse charges because the federal law prohibits that. So in the state of let's just say the city of Milwaukee, we get anywhere from 12,000 to 16,000 felony charges a year. We have about roughly, I believe, 124 prosecuting attorneys. So do the math. There's no way that all of those individuals that are charged with felonies are going to be able to continue to be charged with felonies because you don't have that much prosecuting power to actually make sure that those cases are prosecuted. So a lot of those cases would be pleaded down to misdemeanors. Now, the bad part about those cases that were originally charged as felonies, but then being prosecuted as misdemeanors, the bad part of that is that that would not, unless it was a domestic violence incident, prevent those individuals from being concealed carry holders and carrying guns around the city of Milwaukee. And so what you would see individuals who were arrested 10, 20 times, maybe being charged upon original arrest with felonies, but then not being prosecuted with felonies, being prosecuted with misdemeanors. So those individuals were still eligible for concealed carry. So concealed carry in Milwaukee looked a lot different from concealed carry in some place like Wausau. And so we needed to change that, because what we ended up finding was that individuals who were convicted felons would just hire their buddies to be their security. And those buddies were probably just as bad characters as those individuals with felonies. They just had not been charged with a felony. So you saw a lot of that. You saw a lot of something called human holsters. For example, if there are 4 individuals in the car, 3 may have been convicted of a felony, 1 person, no felonies, and he's a concealed carry holder. The police pulls them over. All of a sudden, this one concealed carry holder has 4 guns. And he says all of those guns are his. And that was what was known as the human holster. And so we had to go back and create laws that would prevent these things from happening. Now they have something called the Habitual Offender Law, and that provides anyone that has been convicted of habitual offenses, I believe it is 5 within a 7-year period, but I can look that up and get that information to you later to just be specific, can no longer qualify for concealed carry, which in our case, that was the best thing that could happen, because we had such issues with individuals who were prosecuted with misdemeanor offenses, but were really bad characters. And we want to keep the city safe. Also, with the concealed carry, the police are not allowed to retain or keep any information on their concealed carry holders. That is a problem, because we want to make sure that crimes are not increasing because of concealed carry, and that, the city is kept safe. A lot of people think if I have a concealed carry, then I'm safe. There's no need for me to worry. I can walk around, have my gun, and use it. The problem is 10-year-old Sierra Guyton was killed with a legitimate concealed carry holder's gun. He was robbed of his gun just a couple of days before that shooting, and that was the actual gun that one of the convicted felons used to commit that crime. So the element of surprise is always, always, always against those concealed carry holders, because nobody knows that they're going to be robbed. They definitely don't think that their guns are going to be taken, but that's exactly what happens. So this, for me, this opportunity to talk about this gun violence, but also to talk about the personal aspect and how it affects so many families in the city of Milwaukee. No 2-month-old should know what it feels like to be shot. But in Milwaukee, we've had that happen in a bout of road rage. We always talk about the non-fatal shootings. But what about those? We always talk about the fatal shootings, but the individuals who suffer those non-fatal shootings are just as important. Just because the individuals don't die doesn't mean that no harm is done. A lot of those individuals live with the trauma and the difficulty of those shootings for the rest of their life. And for those individuals that are not able to return to full capacity, that have debilitating injuries as a result of that gunfire, those individuals that are paralyzed, that are unable to go back to work, the state pays. The state pays in Social Security disability benefits. So it is up to all of us not only to fight gun violence, but to make sure that the state cares about every single life in this state, because no child should risk losing their life because of their zip code. If a child lives in Milwaukee County, they are 42% more likely to die of a gunshot wound. And that's unacceptable, because these children and their lives matter, and our communities are suffering from trauma. We often talk about food deserts in the inner city, but let's talk about kids not having a safe place to go outside and play, which also leads to obesity. And because of obesity, we're seeing so many disparities that are just almost isolated to the African American and Hispanic communities. So we have to do better. We have to make sure that there are better gun laws in place. And thank you for hosting this and giving me the opportunity to tell you a little bit about what I see in my community on a daily basis. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Senator Johnson. That was so moving, and it's a great reminder of why we all care about this issue so much. And thank you to Representative Andraka. I love to say that because she's my representative, and your passion for gun violence prevention has served you well so far, and it will continue to do so. I'll keep helping you out as much as we can on that. Next is time for our panel. So I want to remind everyone, if you have questions, please enter them into the Q&A box. And after all the panelists speak, we will have time for questions and answers. My name is Annalisa Dickman. I am the Midwest Program Manager for the Brady Center to Prevent Gun Violence. And before that, for a long time, I was the Research Director of the Public Policy Forum. In 2012, when Sandy Hook happened, my daughter was in first grade, and I decided I needed to work on gun policy, that it was unacceptable as a mom to me that my first grader could have been taken from me in the way those first graders were. So I've been doing this for a while now, and I've met both our other panelists before, and we're going to learn a lot from them. So I'm excited for this. Dr. Barbara Moser is a retired family practice physician who provides training, advocacy, and support in caring for persons impacted by suicide. She also teaches the Mindful Self-Compassion program to foster inner strength and resilience, and is an active community partner in Prevent Suicide Greater Milwaukee. Her many years of experience in these areas inform her work to advance compassionate care for individuals living with emotional distress. And our other speaker is Liz Miller. Liz is the volunteer events lead for the West Suburban Milwaukee chapter of Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America. She is an engineer and an attorney, and the mom of 2 young sons. I've heard her speak before. She speaks passionately about preventing gun violence in its many devastating forms. And we'll hear from Liz first. Thanks, Liz.
Thank you, Annalise, for that introduction. And thank you all for having me today. As she mentioned, my name is Liz Miller. I'm a volunteer lead with the Metro Milwaukee Group for Moms Demand Action. And I'm here this afternoon to introduce a few preventative measures that you and others can employ to help reduce gun violence. Specifically, we'll be talking about measures that you can immediately take that can help reduce unintentional shootings and gun thefts, as well as other preventative measures to help those in crisis. First, let's take a look at unintentional shootings, and I'll start with a few statistics. Each year in the United States, nearly 350 children ages 17 and under gain access to a firearm and unintentionally shoot themselves or someone else. Currently in this year, in 2021, there were at least 272 unintentional shootings by children, resulting in 111 deaths and 175 injuries nationally. Take Milwaukee County. Just this past summer, there were 2 young children who died from unintentional shootings, a 2-year-old and a 3-year-old. Also, every year, nearly 700 children die by suicide with a gun. It is also estimated that 5.4 million children in the US live in a household with at least one loaded, unlocked gun. And this number has likely increased in light of the surge of gun sales that occurred during the COVID pandemic. A majority, if not close to all of these shootings, could have been prevented if the firearm had been securely stored. That's why it's so important to remember that even if you are practicing secure storage, or if you don't have a gun in your home, you can't be so sure about other homes. You can't be sure about how responsible other people are being. And that's where our Be Smart program becomes helpful. What can we do? We can learn to be smart. Let me just put a pic on the screen. SMART is a handy acronym that you can use to help normalize conversations about gun safety and take responsible actions that can prevent child gun deaths and injuries. The S in SMART stands for secure, as in secure all guns in your home, and vehicles. Securing firearms mean the guns are being stored locked, whether that's in a safe or with a gun lock, and they are being stored unloaded, and they are being stored separate from any ammunition. Hiding a gun is not securing it. M is for model, as in model responsible behavior. This means that smart adults make sure that kids don't have an opportunity to access guns. If you possess guns in the house, you are not just securely storing them, you are ensuring that your child doesn't know where guns are stored, or the combination to the gun safe, or the location of the keys for the gun locks. It also means that they don't know how to unlock or otherwise access the firearms. That said, you can't control the environment that your child is in all the time. So you should teach them not to touch a gun if they come across one, real or pretend, and give them the tools to get out of dangerous situation. And of course, tell them to alert an adult. A is for ask, as in ask about unsecured guns in other homes. As mentioned before, 5.4 million kids live in a home with an unsecured gun. Make it part of your general safety conversation that you have when sending your child over to a new home. Just like you might do when you discuss your child's allergies. If you're uncomfortable at first, try it in a text or an email. One strategy a few of us leaders like to do is simply assume the caregiver or other parents are gun owners. And then we tell them, just want to ask you, how do you store your gun in your home? Then based on their response, you can continue the conversation if necessary. R is for recognize. Recognize the role of guns in suicide. Most people who attempt suicide do not die unless they use a gun. Firearms are the most lethal method in suicide attempts. In fact, 90% of suicide attempts with a gun results in a death, a much higher fatality rate than any other means of self-harm. This contributes to the fact that 40% of child suicides involve a gun. As our children get older, you might need to consider taking another look at your storage methods. If you're using a gun lock to secure your firearm, you might want to consider using a gun safe. And if you know your loved one is in distress, you might want to consider temporarily removing a gun from your home. I'll mention a few options that may be available to you when we discuss preventative measures for dealing with people in crisis later in this discussion. And finally, T is for tell. Tell your peers to be smart. The more we talk about Be Smart program with others, the more people become aware and start modeling responsible behavior. The more people securely store their guns and continue to reevaluate their storage method. And the more we normalize this important conversation. It's so important that the people who own and work with guns are part of this conversation. Now let's turn our attention to gun thefts, and I'm going to provide a few more statistics. And Senator Johnson provided some as well before. Estimates from various sources suggest that between 200,000 and 500,000 guns are stolen from individuals each year. Research suggests that nearly 1/4 of stolen guns are taken from cars and other vehicles. The ATF, that's the agency that regulates the use and transfer of firearms, reports that nearly 60,000 guns are trafficked across state lines each year, the vast majority of which flow from states with weaker gun laws to states with tougher laws. Stolen guns undermine the enforcement of our gun laws and often end up in the possession of someone who is legally prohibited from having guns. Likewise, many guns found at crime scenes can be traced through the underground market. A study of crime scenes in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, for example, found more than 30% of the guns that ended up at a crime scene had been stolen. So what can you do to reduce gun thefts? For starters, as a gun owner, you can store your firearms responsibly. Gun owners are significantly less likely to have a gun stolen if they store all of their guns locked and unloaded. Yet more than half of gun owners do not store all of their guns responsibly. According to one study, encouraging or requiring gun owners to take a safety course that focuses specifically on best practices for gun storage could improve responsible storage and potentially reduce gun thefts. Lawmakers can mandate that any required firearm safety training course for handgun carry permit also covers responsible firearm storage and the threat of stolen guns. Likewise, legislators can also require a permit to carry a loaded handgun in a vehicle to ensure that the gun owners take firearm safety training and are aware of responsible storage practices. This is a crucial step that could encourage responsible storage in vehicles. More training. In Wisconsin, there were changes to the law in 2011, and now currently, handguns are allowed to be loaded while being transported or stored in a vehicle. Long guns, however, such as rifles or shotguns, must be unloaded while transported or stored in a vehicle. Also under this 2011 Wisconsin law change, an employer may not prohibit an employee from carrying or storing a concealed weapon in the employee's vehicle while on the employer's property. Prohibiting the storage of a concealed weapon in a vehicle while it's unattended could certainly help reduce gun thefts in Wisconsin. However, just mandating more firearm safety training with an emphasis on best storage practices could certainly help. Finally, I want to talk about the roles gun play in suicides and domestic violence and what preventative measures could be taken in these situations. With respect to suicide, I mentioned before, firearms are the most lethal method of self-harm. 90% of suicide attempts using a gun result in death, while only 4% of suicide attempts not involving a firearm result in death, allowing those in crisis an opportunity to obtain help. The US gun suicide rate is 10 times higher than that of other high-income countries. In the US, there are 23,437 suicide gun deaths per year. This equates to an average of 6.8 deaths for every 100,000 people. In Wisconsin, we're just slightly above that national average. Our rate is 7 deaths for every 100,000 people. Also mentioned previously, keeping your firearms securely stored, unloaded, and separate from any ammunition may help prevent those in crisis from obtaining the firearms if they don't know how to unlock or otherwise access them. However, if you know that your loved one is in distress, you might want to consider temporarily removing the gun from your home. There are a few options for voluntarily and temporarily surrendering your loved one's firearms. Your local law enforcement, for example, may be willing to temporarily store the guns. At least it may be long enough to seek help for your loved one. Some licensed gun dealers or gun ranges may also be willing to store the guns on a temporary basis. However, these options are only available if the gun owner is willing to temporarily surrender their firearms. The fact is, firearms don't just play a significant role in suicide attempts. Firearms are also prevalent in domestic violence situations. Every month, an average of 57 women are shot and killed by an intimate partner. And nearly 1 million women alive today have reported being shot or shot at by an intimate partner. Access to a gun makes it 5 times more likely that a woman will die at the hands of a domestic abuser. In more than half of the mass shootings, 53% in fact, the perpetrator shot at an intimate partner or a family member. And while it is prohibited under Wisconsin law for those convicted of felony domestic violence crimes from possessing a gun, as Senator Johnson mentioned, those convicted of misdemeanor domestic violence crimes are not prohibited. Certainly, this is an area in Wisconsin law that needs to be addressed. So what happens when the gun owner is in crisis, meaning either a threat to themselves or others, and not willing to temporarily surrender their firearms? In these situations, extreme risk laws, sometimes referred to as red flag laws, can help. When a person is in crisis and considering harming themselves or others, family members and law enforcement are often the first people to see the warning signs. Extreme risk laws allow loved ones or law enforcement to intervene by petitioning a court for an order to temporarily prevent someone in crisis from accessing guns. Two important facts to point out here are that these orders are temporary and are issued by a judge using a very high standard of burden of proof. In one state, researchers estimate that a suicide is averted in approximately 1 in 10 gun removal cases brought under Connecticut's extreme risk law. It's one of the first laws of its kind in the US. And Indiana saw a 7.5% reduction in its firearm suicide rate in the 10 years following the enactment of its extreme risk laws. Currently, 19 states and Washington, D.C. have enacted extreme risk laws. Unfortunately, Wisconsin is not one of those 19 states yet. Before I turn the conversation over to our next speaker, I need to just mention two more points since we were discussing the role of firearms and how they play with people who are in crisis. If you or someone you know is in crisis and may harm themselves, please call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-TALK, which is 8255, or text HOME to 741-741. That's the crisis text line. It's free from anywhere in the United States. And likewise, if you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233, available 24/7 for confidential assistance from a trained advocate. And now I'd like to turn the program over to Dr. Barbara Moser.
Thanks, Liz, and thanks to everybody who's spoken so passionately about this incredibly important topic. I'm going to expound a bit on the topic of firearms and suicide. I've worked in suicide prevention for the last 13 years in Milwaukee County and statewide. And so, you know, when we talk about suicide, this can really bring up some tough emotions, particularly if we personally have been a survivor of suicide loss or have experienced suicidal thoughts or actions ourselves. And so please take good care of yourself when we talk about this topic, truly, because it really can get pretty painful. And so if you need to take a little break, please do that. In 2018, the suicide rate in the US kind of peaked after a 20-year rise. I mean, really pretty dramatic. And it's come down a little bit in 2019 and a little bit more in 2020 for people who are white. For Black and brown individuals, the suicide rate has gone up in 2020, particularly in youth. And so this is a you know, particular, you know, disturbing news, awful news, and we need to do something about it, right? We really do. We need to address suicide deaths with regard to firearms immediately, yesterday. I mean, this is a public health crisis that we have. Suicide in itself is a public health crisis, and the involvement of firearms especially so, because there's something we can do about it. Firearms are the means used in 50% or more of suicide deaths nationwide, and this is true in Wisconsin as well. Now, if you look at men, that number goes up to 56% of all suicide deaths are firearms deaths. And in veterans, 70%. So these are just horrific numbers, really. When we talk about violent firearm deaths in Wisconsin, fully 70% or more, depending on the year, are suicide deaths, So this is really a public health crisis, right? I mean, on so many levels. So I'd like you to consider this study done by Stanford University, which came out in June of 2020. They looked at 26 million California residents who had purchased and owned a gun. And they followed them over a 12-year period. And they found that men who owned handguns were 8 times more likely to die from suicide than men who did not. In women, it was 35 times as likely. Women who owned handguns were 35 times as likely to die from suicide as women who did not. Now, the risk was very high immediately purchasing a gun, but sadly, this risk persisted. It was an enduring risk. And so it was just as high in the year following the gun purchase. And so it's not just that people buy a gun and then immediately use it to kill themselves, which is horrible, but also just having the gun in your house is a terrible, terrible risk for dying by suicide. So I'm going to actually share a couple of slides just to illustrate a couple of points. So hopefully this will work well. Come on, there we go. Okay, so I just want to share 2 studies because there's a really interesting website if you want to look at this more called Means Matter. It's through Harvard University School of Public Health. And so there are a couple of studies and that look at the case fatality rates by means. So these are 2 different studies. The vertical bar in the middle separates the studies. So the most recent one was from 2019 in the Annals of Internal Medicine, which again shows that about 90% of suicide attempts with a firearm are lethal. It was a little bit lower. The other study was done a number of years ago, but still very high. The relative numbers are quite similar. Drowning comes next and then hanging. So you can see how lethality, the lethalness, how likely the method is to kill you is so important when we talk about risk of suicide and with regard to firearms. So means really matter. And the thing about a suicide crisis is that it can be very, very brief. People sometimes decide to kill themselves in the 5 to 10 minutes prior to the point where they make the attempt. And so there can be very little time for rescue, for discovery, but it's still very important to think about that. 90% of people who survive a suicide attempt don't go on to die from suicide. And so it really makes a difference when we thwart these attempts. It's not that, oh, they're just going to kill themselves anyhow. Most people do not. So it's so important with means to put time and distance in between the person thinking about making this attempt and actually the point where they make the attempt. And so that's why we can do a lot to protect people from these lethal means, and in particular firearms. So as Liz so well said, storing guns out of the home when you have a loved one at home who is at risk for suicide is the best way to do this. And ensuring, and we've talked about this, ensuring that guns are properly locked away and stored, unloaded, not sharing where the keys are. Kids in particular, really, we think they don't know, but they know where the locks are. They know where the keys are. They know the combinations. They're very smart. And so it's incredibly sad when a child dies by suicide from a gun because the parent had a gun in the home that was improperly secured. Okay, and then Liz mentioned red flag legislation, so I'll just note it, and I believe Annalise is going to talk more about that too. I want to just briefly introduce this topic of a model for suicide prevention, which is through the National Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention, and it goes under this #BeTheOne2 hashtag. But it has some steps that are really accessible And I really like this model. And so if you want to know more about this, we've actually done a little videotape of me talking about going through this model in some detail, which we'll send you the link to. But the steps are: ask, keep them safe, be there, help them connect, and follow up. And so these are really, really important steps. It's really important that, you know, when you're noticing somebody in your life who's in distress, that you ask them. I'm going to stop sharing slides now. That you, stop. There we go. That you ask them, you know, how are you doing? Are you thinking of ending your life? Are you thinking of suicide? Because then we can do something about it. And when we ask, we don't plant the idea in their head. Asking actually decreases the distress of people who are thinking of suicide. So we need to ask, we need to be around, we need to be present. Never underestimate your presence, your connection with a person as a protective factor for them. That is one of the biggest protective factors, is connection, belonging, you know, really being a part of community. These are huge protective factors. And so we need to rally around someone when they're thinking about suicide. And then we need to keep them safe. And that's what we've been talking about, right? Reducing access to means, using great tools like safety plans, and frankly, educating our medical and mental health professionals better in how to help people who are in severe distress and considering suicide, and teaching them how to counsel on access to lethal means. Actually, there's a great online free training that's on the Suicide Prevention Resource Center's website on just that, counseling on access for lethal means for healthcare professionals. So these are very, very important. And then we need to connect them to help and follow up. So those are the 5 steps very briefly. So how do we know when somebody's thinking of suicide? There are organizations that are trying to get this information actually out to gun dealers, to gun range owners, on how to protect people from suicide. The American Foundation for Suicide Prevention has an active plan. There are a variety of gunshot projects. The first one started in New Hampshire. Actually, Madison's actually been quite active in this regard as well. And so we need to get this information out to people who can really make a difference. It's us, absolutely, but it's also people who sell firearms to others, who let folks go to a firearms range and shoot a gun. You know, be on the lookout for these warning signs for suicide. It's so important, as well as all of us. It's all of our responsibility. So, you know, what are reasons we might worry about somebody thinking of suicide? Well, maybe they had a loss of some kind, you know, maybe they lost a loved one, maybe their marriage ended, maybe they lost their job, maybe they lost their home. I mean, losses are huge precipitating factors for suicide. And then if we know that about somebody, what are we looking for? Well, we're listening for people talking about wanting to die or kill themselves and taking it seriously. We're listening for people talking about feeling hopeless, having nothing to live for, feeling trapped, feeling like they have no way out. We're looking for people who are actually, why are you buying a gun? You've never been interested in guns. And yet this person is going and they're buying a firearm, you know, or they're talking about it. These are warning signs we need to pay attention to. If they're using more alcohol or drugs than they ever did, if their mood has changed, if it's really extreme, if they're isolating, withdrawing, if they're enraged, if they're talking about seeking revenge, these are people at risk not only to others, but also to themselves, you know, if they're acting recklessly, if they're talking about being a burden to others. So these are some of those warning signs that we can really pay attention to and listen to. So again, in some of the resources that will be sent out, you'll have this model, this ask, keep them safe, be there, connect them to care, follow up. Very important steps that you can take to help somebody in severe distress and save their life. So thanks. I'm so happy to be here today with you and talk about this incredibly important topic. And I'm going to turn it over to Annalise.
Thank you, Dr. Moser, and thank you, Liz. So much great information in those presentations. And my job is to kind of help everybody bring it together and talk about what we can do here as citizens, as activists, as voters, to try to affect some of these changes. You heard a lot of statistics from our previous presenters, and I just want to bring it home to you that everything you heard was exacerbated by COVID. So we've seen more deaths, more injuries, in certain populations, more suicide, and we have definitely seen more gun sales, as was mentioned. So everything that we're worried about is at a really heightened state right now under COVID, and it is urgent. It is so urgent that we take action and that we ensure that our legislators know that now is the time to take action. So I'm going to share one slide with you, if I can find it. So here's what we have right now on the table in front of the legislature that I'd like to talk about. There's actually a lot more bills, great bills being introduced, and we're going to try and move as many forward as we can. But the things we'll focus on today are some upcoming bills, two of which we're hoping will be introduced later this week. A background check bill that would extend background checks to all gun sales, and the extreme risk protective order bill that both Liz and Dr. Moser mentioned, and the ghost gun bill that Representative Andraka mentioned. Then there's the bill that works to prevent suicide by firearm by providing grants to local governments, and those local governments can in turn grant firearm dealers. And this is part of the gun shop project that was just mentioned. This enables firearm dealers to educate their employees about ways to recognize signs of crisis in their customers, about ways to ensure that they feel empowered to turn down a sale if they feel like this sale is too risky for their customers. And it also might provide some funds for gun dealers to beef up their gun storage facility, so maybe another gun safe, so that they could hold on to firearms temporarily for customers when those customers feel like it's just too dangerous to have a firearm in the home. So that bill came out of Speaker Voss's suicide prevention task force that he had a couple summers ago. And this was one of the recommendations, and it's passed both committees in the Assembly and in the Senate, and we'd love to see it move forward. This would be a great way to just start that conversation about guns and suicide. You know, as we mentioned, it's being able to facilitate those conversations is so important. And this is a great way to get to the people who are most at risk. As Dr. Moser mentioned, gun owners are really the ones most at risk of dying by firearm suicide. And Wisconsin, most gun owners tend to be older white men, and most of our suicides are among older white men. So it's no surprise there. And then finally, right now, working its way through the city of Milwaukee is a decision about how we're going to spend some of our COVID relief funds that we got from the federal government. And the Office of Violence Prevention in the city of Milwaukee has asked for $16.8 million of those funds to go to their office so that they can do community violence intervention work. That's the 414 Life Community Violence Intervention Program and other prevention programs. Like I said, right now, COVID has heightened almost every aspect of gun violence, and there are so many more guns in the streets. This is 100% falls under the bill that created this program, the American Relief Funds program. This includes violence intervention work. So now we just need the city to allocate these funds to the Office of Violence Prevention. And so anybody that lives in the city of Milwaukee, if you could please put this on your to-do list to reach out to your alderperson about this, that would be wonderful. So what I'm going to talk about in more depth over our next few minutes is the Universal Background Check Bill and the Extremist Protective Order Bill. Those two bills are really the keys to getting a lot of these other things to work properly. So we definitely need universal background checks if a lot of other legislative priorities are going to work properly. So for the most part, just about everyone in Wisconsin who's bought a gun has gone through a background check. I mean, the vast majority of folks go through background checks because the vast majority of folks go to a gun store to buy a gun. But our best estimate based on surveys of gun owners is up to 22% of American firearms are purchased without a background check. And 22% might not sound like a ton, but it's a ton of guns that have come out to the streets without a background check, and we need to close that loophole. So Wisconsin would like to join the many other states that have already done this by ensuring that every single gun sale includes a background check. Now, this bill's been proposed a couple times before, so I'm assuming that the next one that's proposed will look like how those other bills looked. And if that's the case, what it will require is for every gun sale, which as Senator Johnson mentioned, you know, I could buy a gun from my neighbor right now in Wisconsin and not go through a background check, and that's perfectly legal. This bill would require me and my neighbor to go to Cabela's, for instance, any sort of gun store, licensed federal firearm dealer, and I would have to fill out the form that says I'm the one purchasing the gun, and the dealer would have to conduct a background check just as if I were the dealer's customer, and then the gun could be transferred to me from my neighbor, and then the dealer would maintain that form just like he would for all his own customers. And the federal law requires dealers to keep those forms for as long as they're in business. So this is how 13 other states and Washington, D.C. require gun sales to happen in their states. So this isn't a new idea that we just came up with in Wisconsin. It's not unproven. You know, that's a lot of the pushback is, how would that even work? Well, it works in these other places and they've been doing it for quite a long time. So it's not a new idea. It's not risky. People get used to it. Gun dealers like it because once people are in the store, maybe they'll buy some ammo there. Maybe they'll buy something else while they're there. They can also charge for that processes. So we think it's a great bill that would go a long way to ensuring all gun sales go with a background check. And it would also underpin all the other bills that we want to do, like the ghost gun bill. Why is the ghost gun bill so important? Because ghost guns are guns that don't have serial numbers. So either someone made it themselves or they purchased various parts and put it together. Can't be traced by law enforcement. But if that ghost gun was sold with a background check, there would have to be some sort of marking on the gun. And now it becomes a gun that can be traced by law enforcement. So the background check bill really underpins a lot of the other things we want to get done. And we know that background checks save lives. Like I said, all these other states have these bills. They've had them for a while. There's been research done. They lower homicide rates. There's a study that shows that states that have laws that require background checks for private gun sales are associated with 10% with homicide rates that are 10% lower. But they also lower suicide rates, which is just as important. And as Barbara said, most of the gun deaths in Wisconsin are suicide deaths. So laws that require universal background checks or a permit to purchase before a gun is sold, those laws are associated with not only a lower firearm suicide rate, but a lower overall suicide rate and fewer deaths by suicide. So the RAND Corporation, which is a research group in California, said, what would happen if there was a universal background check law in Wisconsin? So no other Wisconsin gun laws change, but we have universal background checks. Based on the experiences of these other states, what would we expect to see in Wisconsin? And what they projected was that we would see a decline in the number of firearm homicides of between 8 and 20%. And we would see a decline in the number of firearm suicide deaths of between 5 and 15%. So that's significant if you think of how many families that would impact in Wisconsin. And they also project declines in the number of mass shootings, unintentional firearm deaths, and even other violent crime that aren't shootings, but use a firearm. So this is why this will be one of the priorities that we'll be working on in this legislative session is universal background checks. So to switch gears for a little bit, let's talk about the Extreme Risk Protective Order bill that's been brought up now a couple times. Again, this is not something new and invented in Wisconsin. As Liz said, 19 other states plus DC have extreme risk protective order laws. And there's been some research, which I can tell you about, that shows how they work. But for our purposes, I want you to think of an extreme risk protective order like you would a domestic violence restraining order. So the judges across the state that are used to having people appear in front of them and talking about the evidence that there's a specific threat in a domestic violence relationship or in a domestic relationship, they weigh that evidence to see how credible that threat is, to see how imminent that threat is, and then they issue a restraining order. And in Wisconsin, that restraining order includes the removal of firearms. All that would happen just almost the exact same way, but the types of threats would be expanded. So right now, it has to be a domestic relationship with a threat of violence in order to get an order to remove the firearms. Under Extreme Risk Protective Order bill, it could be other types of threats. So threats to oneself, threats of self-harm or suicide, threats made in other contexts like threats to a neighbor or a classmate or a coworker would be included. But the judge would behave in the same way. The process would be the same. So the judge would weigh the evidence in a very similar way. The judge would look for an imminent credible threat. The judge might weigh other factors, like Barbara said, was this a very recent firearms acquisition and you've never shown an interest in firearms before and you've been talking about wanting to end your life, or maybe you have threatened your wife with a firearm in the past. Things like that can all inform the judge's decision. So we know from those 19 other states and Washington, DC, how well they work. And Liz mentioned some of that. What I think is very interesting is that Connecticut, which has had this law since 1999, has found that when these orders are issued, law enforcement recovers on average per order 7 firearms. So this is a meaningful way to take action to protect someone. So what would happen in Wisconsin if we had an extreme risk protective order bill? So we looked at it at Brady. We looked at Connecticut as a model and said, if Wisconsin had the exact same experience as Connecticut, what would happen? And I think that's a pretty good comparison because the demographics of deaths in suicide in Wisconsin are very similar to the demographics in Connecticut, and that it tends to be older white male gun owners. And so if we learn the lessons of Connecticut and applied them to Wisconsin, what might we expect? Well, we would expect, as the program grows in Wisconsin, that we could see around 300 firearms removed per year total in Wisconsin. And that over the first 10 years of having this law, we would prevent up to 70 deaths. So it'd be pretty significant for those families if you think of 70 families who now have a loved one with them that they otherwise would have lost. So I'm going to share my screen again with just a few steps that we can all take. In the next 24 hours after this program is over, you will receive an email from Grassroots North Shore that will include a lot of links for you to take action. It will include links to all of our organizations and to WAVE, the Wisconsin Anti-Violence Education Fund. Please take those, visit those links, take those action, join the various groups so you can stay up to date. The Grassroots North Shore group will continue to do our work on gun violence prevention, and you can visit our website regularly to stay up to date and get the newsletters. Of course, call and email your state legislators. All of the bills that we mentioned, start calling and emailing right now, asking your legislators to co-sponsor, to vote for them, to let them know you support these bills and you want to see them pass the legislature. And if you are a resident of Milwaukee, please call and email your alderperson and let them know the Office of Violence Prevention needs those funds from the COVID relief funding to prevent gun violence in Milwaukee. Okay, now, so thank you. My piece is over. Now we're going to go into questions and answers. I am going to pull up all of our panelists so that everyone's available to answer questions. Okay, hopefully this is, everybody can see the whole panel now. And if you have questions, again, please enter them into the Q&A box. And we have a few others that were sent in ahead of time. So I'm going to start with one of those. And I'm just going to throw this out there to everyone. So, you know, whoever unmutes first, have at it. But the first question is, there's a lot of polling out there that shows a majority of voters, including a majority of Wisconsin voters, want to see these kind of bills pass. They support universal background checks. They support all these things we've been talking about. So why aren't they getting passed in Wisconsin? I think Representative Dr. or Senator Johnson should take that one.
That's a great question. That's partly why I ran for office. The short answer is we need to elect more people who believe that this is how we're going to keep our community safe. That we need more legislators who are willing to talk about this issue and who are willing to stand up for it. And in particular, Republicans who are willing to stand up for this. The Republicans hold an overwhelming majority in the Assembly and the Senate, and they get to control what bills come up for discussion and what bills get debated. And like I said in the earlier part of the segment, if we're not talking about this, we can't fix it. So the first step is to demand once we're introducing these bills, like Annalisa said, later this week, we will reintroduce background checks and extreme risk protection orders. This is a conversation we need to have. The number of guns in homes is skyrocketing. The number of suicides is skyrocketing. And it's time we have an honest conversation about what that means for people in Wisconsin.
And I also just want to add why it's so important that we enact fair maps.
Thank you, Liz. And that Grassroots North Shore is definitely very active in the Fair Maps movement. And that's another activist subcommittee that people can join with Grassroots North Shore if they want to get more involved with that. Did you want to add anything, Senator Johnson?
No, other than the fact that everything that Rep. Andraka said. Another thing for me is the NRA. I used to think that that was just, I don't know, a fathom. But one year, I was really close to Representative Clayfish. We did a lot of legislation together, a lot. I took a couple of gun bills to him and he looked at them. I was hoping that he would take about 2 or 3, but he ended up accepting all of them except 2. So I thought, okay, this is really good. And then he came back and he was like, you know, I can't do it. I just can't. And his assistant said, you don't want to have the NRA all over your back during an election year. And so that kind of told me that the power that everybody thinks they have, they actually do.
Yeah, that's a shame. I've been really encouraged over the past several years to see so many more folks on our side of the issue showing up. The red shirts for Moms Demand Action seem to be at the Capitol all the time, at every hearing. I think, hopefully we can just push back against that notion that the NRA is the only game in town for getting voters to vote on this issue. Like, we have voters on our side of the issue too.
And I would also say we need more gun owners to speak up, because there is this dichotomy out there where either, you have guns and you don't want any gun laws, or else you want to take guns away from people who do. When I was a volunteer with Moms Demand Action, I came up against that all the time, which is why after my father passed away, he was a Republican, he was a member of the NRA, and he had handguns. So I legally shipped to a licensed firearms dealer, went through the background check process, and then I got my concealed carry permit and I got my basic handgun certification. So I can talk about these things and these holes in the law that the other side just perpetuates. Like, no, we are not coming after your gun if you are a law-abiding citizen and you don't have anything in your background. So that would be something else that would be very helpful, is for more gun owners to talk about how the more people who commit crimes with guns, the worse it looks for the law-abiding gun owners in our state. And there are plenty of them. We don't want to take guns away from any hunters. We don't want to take guns away from people who own them and treat them responsibly and store them safely. What we want to do is to reduce the number of gun deaths. And if another group is going to be on the side of gun deaths, well, I can explain that to the people of Wisconsin.
Thank you. And this question, I think, really speaks to Dr. Moser's expertise. So how do we make guns, firearms, a less polarizing issue? We know that suicide in particular cuts across all families. It's not just it's not just an issue that's for one type of family. Republicans and Democrats both experience this. So how do we encourage more bipartisan support of these life-saving bills?
Well, I think addressing it as a public health issue for everybody is one way to do that, and to start these conversations around the subject of, do you want your dad to have this gun in the house? He's had depression. He's just lost your mom, in a death. He's really sad. He's really distressed. What do you think about that? I mean, we got to get personal with it. We've got to get to the emotion behind it, and have some really real conversations about how guns and, my areas in suicide, how guns are used for suicide. And this cuts across all demographics, period. End of the conversation, So I think that's one way to do it. I'm sure other people have other wonderful ideas on that.
Liz, how has Moms attract folks from both sides of the spectrum?
What I think Moms has done a very good job, and it falls in line with how every town has been framing up the issue too, is it's about gun violence and reducing gun violence. And that, I think, is a hard stance to say you're against. And keeping it very fact-based. Emotions run high when you're dealing with guns, and it's important to stand behind the facts. And I think Moms has done a great job of using that evidence to decide their policy decisions. And likewise, we've been able to use that just to inform our volunteers and enable them to have the conversation with their peers and their family. And so sometimes it's great to put the emotion in there, but sometimes you have to step back and take the emotion out of it too, and just use the facts. Because again, it's hard when you're staring at some of these statistics.
I might just add one thing, if that's okay, which
Sure.
is that I think, you know, and I think we're all responsible for this, that we've got a real othering, us, them sort of society right now. And I think one thing we can all personally do, and I tell myself this too, when my little judgy mind, you know, kicks in, is that everybody has different needs and everybody is trying to fulfill their own needs and of their family and their loved ones. And we've got to start hearing perspectives of people who are not like-minded with us, because that's how we make bridges. We get to know people as people. And that, I believe, is the answer to a lot of our problems. And it you know, it's a huge problem, but it's got to start somewhere. So why not with all of us, everybody on the call today, you know, start having some real conversations with people who don't think like you about it. And just be curious, be open to what they have to say. And that's where we find, I think, some common ground.
I think that's right. And as Senator Johnson just said, you know, it's when she's reaching out to a Republican colleague, you can find common ground. I mean, people don't want families to suffer. They don't want parents to lose children. They don't want me to lose my, you know, hunter father-in-law. So we can, you know, we can find common ground with people who it might appear we don't have anything in common with. If we just start at that basic level of valuing life and valuing families. Okay, so it looks like we have a couple questions in the chat. Keith, thank you for sending questions. Keith wants to know what percentage of shootings take place between people who know each other? And in line with this, do we know what percentage of shootings are impulse shootings and not in the commission of a crime? I don't know the answer to that. Do we have anyone here that? Go ahead.
Sir, I don't know if that statistic is available, and I certainly don't know it off the top of my head if it is. But I can try to look that up.
Yeah, the city of Milwaukee does a fairly good job of putting their crime data on the Milwaukee web portal. So you can look up and see fatal shootings, non-fatal shootings, and then they have a shoot review process afterwards that really goes in depth and looks at the network of people who are associated with the shooter, the network of people who are associated with the victim, any sort of explanatory factors that might have been underlying. And so I think there are people that might know the answer to that. It just isn't those of us on this panel, but we can try to figure that out and get it out to everybody. Keith also posted that there's a reminder that tonight at 8 o'clock on CNN, there's a documentary airing called NRA, The Price of Freedom. And I'm really looking forward to that. I have my DVR set, so I hope everyone else does too. I think that'll be a good explainer of how the NRA gained power over time and how they're at the precipice now of maybe not even existing in the future. Thanks to the work of a lot of people in this state, actually, who did a lot of behind the scenes work on finding the evidence that the NRA wasn't following the law. Okay, let me look at my list here. It was mentioned a few times, both by Liz and Barbara, that the accessibility of firearms is so important, both to prevent child access, to prevent suicide. So what's the status in Wisconsin on requiring safe firearm storage? Who do we require that of anybody? What do we require?
Last session, I know Representative Lisa Subek had a package of bills that required safe storage, and Colorado has recently passed some legislation on that as well. We hope to be reintroducing that again to start kickstarting the conversation. And I think it's particularly timely after a year of record gun sales, particularly with a number of first-time gun owners. I would like to see us start talking a lot more about safe storage and what that looks like. And the program that Moms Demand Action has, the Be Smart program, is a really great place to start. So we will be taking a look at that over the next couple months.
And then Senator Johnson talked about the role of gun dealers and how we have straw purchasers and how we might crack down on that type of gun trafficking actions. And that's something Brady has been concerned about, is trying to identify the gun dealers who are turning a blind eye to straw purchasers or gun trafficking purchases. And I'm wondering where we are in Wisconsin, where we are about thinking about trying to regulate the industry a little more.
So with the Republicans, it's hard pressed to get anything done regarding gun violence, gun sales. I talked a little bit earlier about the habitual offender piece. The habitual offender piece would have created a penalty enhancer, which would have prevented individuals who were convicted of 3 misdemeanors in 5 years from getting a concealed carry permit. It was actually requested by the last chief, Chief Lynn, and the city of Milwaukee, because of Milwaukee's issues with habitual offenders having guns. And so the GOP refused. So that is not a determinant to deter people from getting concealed carry permits, which I thought was, but I misspoke. It's not. The only disqualifier is felonies, basically, and misdemeanors under federal law. Now, we have also tried to match federal law with state law. So federal law says that if you have been convicted of domestic violence, even if it's a misdemeanor, you cannot have a concealed carry. We've tried to say, look, federal law already prevents that. We can do that in Wisconsin. As a matter of fact, the habitual offender and the federal law piece with state law piece were 2 of the bills that I took to Representative Clayfish, and they said no. So it's really, really difficult to get my Republican colleagues to do anything outside of creating stiffer penalties. They are not against stiffer penalties, but the problem with the penalties, the stiffer penalties, is it's an after effect. And so the crime would still have to be created, and then, the penalties would then take place. Some of the other conversations that I've had with some of my colleagues outside of Milwaukee, and even some colleagues here in Milwaukee, is that this isn't happening in my district, which was one of the reasons that I mentioned that people who live in Milwaukee are Wisconsinites too. And, as a state, we're supposed to care about everybody. So those are a lot of the challenges. It's just getting them to move on anything that has to do with gun violence, especially since they feel that it's an urban issue and not necessarily a rural issue. And I do have to say that there are Republicans who feel the same way, who want to do things for gun violence, but are prevented from some of their other colleagues. It always goes back to the freedom piece, but what happens to the freedom for little kids to just be able to make it to adulthood or play on the streets of Milwaukee? And so that continues to be an issue.
Thank you. I'm told we have time for one more question, and I'm going to take moderator's prerogative and ask everyone to quickly what do you hope everyone listening to this webinar does in the next week to move this issue forward a little bit? What's one thing we can all do in the next week? I'll start with Liz.
Call and email your state senators and assembly people and just ask for action. I believe the email is going to list a few bills. Ask for background checks, ask for a red flag law. I ask for all of these issues that we're raising and keep doing it over and over.
Dr. Moser, what do you hope everyone does?
I hope everybody really learns some of these warning signs for suicide and really starts noticing in your own life all the different people you come in contact with who might be in distress, and start having conversations with those folks that you really, really can make a difference just by caring. Thank you.
Senator Johnson.
I can't agree more about the reaching out to your elected officials piece. You know, a lot of times people only reach out to the electeds that represent them in their district. Reach out to all of us. We have a system in Madison called Forward. And if my office gets contact about a particular issue, we always document what the issue is with the person who did the reaching out, and we keep a record of that. And sometimes when you, some electeds will say, well, nobody's reached out to my office, so it's not that big a deal. And this is a really, really big deal. So most definitely continue to reach out. The one thing that we know about Wisconsin is that Wisconsin doesn't have walls. And so what's happening in Milwaukee today can very well happen in Mequon tomorrow, or other places, you know, the day after. And then is that the time to care? You want to be preventive rather than reactive. And making sure that, you know, all counties have a sense of safety is the best way to protect where you live. And getting my colleagues to realize that, you know, it's becoming more and more difficult, but definitely reach out to your elected officials.
Representative Andraka.
Well, I would definitely agree with that. And I would also like to see people start talking about this as the public health crisis that it is. I believe Dr. Moser was talking about, we're not talking about whether or not you have a right to own firearms. What we're talking about is preventing unnecessary deaths. What we're talking about is keeping guns away from children. And we have reached a point where they're not accidents anymore. I mean, these are, if you're leaving a gun around the home, you need to understand what your responsibilities are. And we need to talk about just the dramatic increase in gun suicides as well. And I can't tell you how many times when I speak to my colleagues, they say, well, if someone is suicidal, well, they will find a way to complete suicide. And that is simply not true. It is a myth. And if you use a gun, it is lethal 90% of the time. And we need to give people a chance. And so when we're talking about it from a public health perspective, I'd like to see us do more of that, because so much of the rhetoric and so much of the partisanship has been around this about Second Amendment rights. But what we're talking about are people's rights to live their lives, as Senator Johnson said, and for kids to grow up free from violence. And I think that's something that we can all agree on.
Thank you. For me, I would say everybody please go to the Grassroots North Shore website, sign up for the newsletters, and also sign up for the fundraiser on December 5th, because Grassroots North Shore is how we gather people together and get forward motion on this movement here on the North Shore. Please tell your friends you came to this webinar, you got great information, you're excited to work on this issue moving forward. And then join us at the fundraiser. That's how we do all the things we do. I made so many phone calls for Deb Andraka through Grassroots North Shore, and it was actually fun. So we need all the support we can get. That's how we affect these changes. So before we go, thank you so much to our speakers and our panelists. You all were wonderful and gave such great information. I also need to thank Eileen Stevens, who is our behind the scene technical guru, and Keith for kicking us off. And very sincere thanks to Shirley Horowitz, who is my co-chair and basically through sheer force of will got this event to happen. And she did a wonderful job. So thank you all. Look for that email and follow the links and take action. We really appreciate everybody. Goodbye.
Thank you.